Father, we are so thankful to be gathered together, Lord, during this season, and we come now to the words of this author of wisdom who tells us the story of suffering and helps us to ask the questions we need to ask so that we can understand who you are, even when things don't go the way we expect. Be with us, Lord, in your name. Amen. So we started, if you're just joining us, we've been in the book of Job, and we started the series by saying the book of Job in the Old Testament is really about searching for answers in the face of suffering. That's not to say that we'll find any answers, and we really haven't, but there have been many things that help us raise the right questions when we're going through suffering. What are we to make of suffering? You know, who is God in the midst of suffering? And in the way the book of Job presents it, it's even more complex than that, because it's not just what's the purpose of suffering, but what do you do with suffering when it happens and there's no earthly reason or explanation for that suffering to occur? The book began with a short narrative. There's this man named Job who's blameless and upright. In the council room of God, God himself declares that Job is a person who fears God and shuns evil. So we know right off the bat, we have this extremely righteous man. And then we see that the challenger, or the adversary, questions God's policies on righteousness. He says, if it's true that the righteous will prosper and the wicked will suffer, which was the way that many people, the retribution policy that many people think of, if that's true, then how do you know who's really righteous for righteousness' sake, or whether they're just righteous because you're giving them all this stuff? And so he points to Job, and he says, what about Job? Take away his prosperity, all of his wealth, and see if he will still bless you to your face. So God accepts the challenge, allows the adversary to take all of Job's possessions, his family, his wealth, and ultimately even his health. So we're presented with this extremely righteous person, the most righteous person on the earth, who faces extreme calamity, more than we could possibly imagine, and certainly more than we would expect to happen to this righteous man, Job. The rest of the book of Job is his three friends trying to sort it out with him, and this is what we've looked at over the course of the last 8 or 9 weeks, this dialogue that's presented to us in poetic form, going back and forth between Job's friends and himself, trying to figure out why Job is suffering. His three friends insist that the suffering that Job is facing must be because he was wicked, but Job continues to maintain his innocence, challenging what his friends believed about God, but also acknowledging that God was still sovereign. Job didn't understand why he was facing the suffering that he did, and he challenges God to give him a reason. He doesn't say God doesn't have a reason. He just doesn't know what it is, and so he demands a response. And so last week, we reached the climax of Job's argument, which is what Joey presented to us. And basically, whether it was Job's words or a latter author, or the author of the book who added these words in, the main thrust of Job's entire argument has been basically that only God is wise. We can't know the answer to this. His friends claim to have wisdom. Job thought he had wisdom. But in the end, he said, the only one who can really answer me is God. And that's the audience he demands. He demands a hearing from God. And so, the last line of Job chapter 31, which we looked at last week, is the words of Job are ended. And that's what brings us to today. The book takes a surprising turn, because all of a sudden, in Job 32, we're introduced to a completely new character who we haven't heard from, hasn't been said. We have no reason to even know that this person was sitting there in the pile of ashes with Job and his friends. All of a sudden, he's mentioned, and his name is Elihu. He all of a sudden just enters into the text. Now let me read the introduction of Job 32. We turn to this another section of prose, a piece of narrative setting this up. So these three men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Then Elihu, the son of Barachel the Buzite, of the family of Ram, burned with anger. He burned with anger at Job because he justified himself rather than God. He burned with anger also at Job's three friends because they had found no answer, although they had declared Job to be in the wrong. Now Elihu had waited to speak to Job because they were older than he was, and when Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, he burned with anger. This introduces us to Elihu, and there's more going on here than we might first understand that I think is really important to figure out what's happening and where this speech fits. Job's three friends have given up on Job because they said Job is righteous in his own eyes. There was no turning Job's mind around. Job believed that he was innocent. He maintains his integrity, and finally they've had enough. Everything they believed, all the wisdom in the world, told them that Job must have been wicked, but Job refused to accept their analysis. So they give up, Job's done talking. Now his friends are done talking. And that's when this young guy who's sitting around the ash heap finally has enough and can't hold it in any longer. And he's about to go on a speech, if you read it, that's about 5 chapters long. And not that he was dividing it into chapters, but in our book, it's five chapters long. And he goes on a rant. And it really is a rant. Like we'll see today, it's actually really confusing what he's saying. But there are some things you need to know about Elihu. First of all, the name Elihu and why that's important. It means he is God. Not that Elihu is God, but that and he's the first person in the text to have a Hebrew name. So all of a sudden this Hebrew steps in, Elihu, whose name means he is God, who also is given the longest introduction of his family, either because he doesn't have credentials himself or because it's supposed to set something up about who he is and what he's going to say. So his father, Baruchel, means God's blessing, or blessing comes from God. So whether he's introduced that way because he lacks personal credentials, his name is intended to indicate something to us, that there's something else going on here. Secondly, Elihu is young. We see that we don't know how young, but he's young enough that he's felt like he should, let the adults do the talking while he sat there and watched. He wasn't trying to get involved out of deference to their wisdom. But now he's had enough, and like a young person would, after listening to his elders go back and forth for however long it was, he finally says, oh yeah, well, I got something to say. And so he steps in. Here's how his speech starts in Job 32:6. And Elihu, the son of Baruchel the Buzite, answered and said, I am young in years, and you are aged. Therefore I was timid and afraid to declare my opinion to you. I said, let days speak, and many years teach wisdom. But it is the spirit in man, the breath of the Almighty, that makes him understand. It is not the old who are wise, nor the aged who understand what is right. Therefore I say, listen to me, let me also declare my opinion. So this also sets up the occasion for his speech. Everyone else is done by the time he pipes in. He can't hold it in. He's sitting there burning with anger, which is part of the way I think his youth comes out. He says, I thought I could sit here and let your many years teach us wisdom, but the only thing I've learned is that you have no idea what you're talking about. So as long as I've been listening, I've decided to speak as too. And so you can imagine a young person sitting around this pile of ashes, finally just brewing with anger and just saying, enough is enough. What's wrong with all you people? So the fourth thing to note, though, is Job's response to Elihu, which in short is there isn't one. We don't, unlike every other dialogue we've looked at, Job does not respond to Elihu. That's because until God speaks, Job is going to remain silent. Job's words are ended. He demanded an audience of God. He no longer has time to respond to man's arguments. Which finally leads us to the content of Elihu's speech. I already said that his speech is actually really confusing. Commentators are not even entirely sure why it's here. Elihu sort of begins speaking, and it seems like he just starts talking, and when he realizes no one's going to stop him, he just tries to find it along the way, like an ancient Michael Scott. At times, he appears sympathetic to Job, and then he attacks Job. He opens up in anger at Job's 3 friends and takes aim at them, but this sometimes seems to agree with them. Some commentators, especially earlier ones, see Elihu as extremely arrogant because of the way he talks about himself. But as we'll see this week, or we'll see next week, all of Job's other friends end up getting chastised by God, but Elihu doesn't. So there's something about this speech, there's something about Elihu's posture, even if it's said in youthful arrogance, that is at least moving us in the right direction. So I think we have to understand Elihu's speech primarily through the lens of a literary technique, that the author has included it here to, I think, in some ways it functions like comic relief, because you should be imagining these 4 older men sitting there, and then Elihu just sort of standing up and just ranting at them for 15 minutes, and then none of them say anything. Like, it just ends, and he sits down and they're like, anything else? There's no response. But in another way, I think Elihu functions as the voice of the reader, which is that at this point, we should all be a little frustrated. We should all be a little angry that no answers have been found. And so in many ways, Elihu's speech is speaking on behalf of the reader. He's living with these 2 competing realities that Joey pointed out last week that create this dissonance. The competing realities of This suffering is happening to Job. God is still sovereign. What am I supposed to do about this? And so, as a literary device, Elihu's speech functions as a way of cluing us into the frustration that everyone is feeling. And we should be feeling if we've been paying attention. So let's see what Elihu has to say. Now, most commentators break up Elihu's speech into 4 different speeches, but we're just going to take 3 of them, or look at them in 3 sections. The first thing Elihu says is that suffering may serve a positive purpose. This is one of the main differences between Elihu and Job's other friends. Elihu is at least somewhat sensitive to Job's situation, not entirely, but at the outset, rather than just turning on Job, he wants to find some alternative explanation for why Job might be suffering. And so here's what he says, Job 33:6, "Behold, I am toward God as you are. I too was pinched off from a piece of clay. You don't need to be terrified of me. My pressure will not be heavy on you." None of his friends approached him that way, but he says, instead of talking about where he got his wisdom, he starts by saying, I'm a man like you are. Like, let's start on the ground together. Now, there's going to be arrogance in what he says, as we'll see, but at least his starting point is saying, I'm not going to put myself on par with God. I'm not going to speak for God. I'm just going to sit here with you. And so his argument may be a little meandering, and it may be motivated by anger, but Elihu still fears God. He reminds Job of Job's own argument. Job says in verse 9, "You say, I am pure without transgression, I'm clean, and there is no iniquity in me. Behold, God finds occasion against me. He counts me as his enemy. He puts my feet in the stocks and watches all my paths." Again, he's just reminding Job, this is what you've said. You feel like God has put you in darkness, that Job, you have no knowledge of God's purposes. You think God is ignoring you. He won't speak to you. He won't listen to you. God is nowhere to be found. But Elihu turns and has a different take. Verse 12, "Behold, in this you are not right. I will answer you, for God is greater than men. Why do you contend against him, saying he will answer none of man's words? For God speaks in one way, and in 2, though man does not perceive it." He goes on, "Man is also rebuked with pain on his bed and with continual strife in his bones, so that life loathes bread, and his appetite the choicest food." Elihu's take on Job's suffering is that suffering may not have to do with Job's past sins, which is what all his friends were saying. Elihu does not say, at least initially, that Job's suffering is because of some past wickedness. What he is saying is that perhaps your suffering now is related to something that will happen in the future. Maybe he's taking a future-oriented approach to suffering. The other guys all wanted to point backwards. Something you did probably caused this. But Elihu is saying, what if there's something in the future that you don't know about that God is preparing you for or helping you to avoid? What if there's something that you don't know about that's going to come about on you, and so therefore maybe God's not absent in your suffering. Maybe God is actually speaking to you through the suffering. So his example is like a man laying on his bed in pain. And he says, isn't it possible that whatever suffering you're experiencing is actually God speaking to you, that maybe there's something that's endangering your life, and the temporary pain or suffering is actually a sign of God's mercy? He says it this way in verse 23, "If there be for him or a man an angel, a mediator, one of the 1,000, to declare to man what is right for him, and he is merciful to him and says, deliver him from going down to the pit, I have found a ransom." What if there's an angel, Elihu's saying, or a mediator who's speaking on your behalf the way that you want him to, but you just don't fully understand it? Like, what if what has happened to you has helped you avoid some greater calamity that you aren't aware of? He uses this language. He says, what if what has happened to you now has actually served as a ransom so that you're being rescued from something worse that could potentially happen to you? Now, here's where we have to be extremely careful, because as I've said, the hope of future glory, even the promise of resurrection, should not be used to diminish the darkness that we're experiencing now. And so Elihu's on dangerous ground in that regard, because we've already seen that Job would prefer death. So saying to Job, well, maybe the reason you went through this suffering is to help you avoid death, Job might go, well, I'd rather not have had that. But despite Elihu's insensitivity to Job's situation overall, or his general sensitivity, this is not a very sensitive thing to say. In some ways, it echoes what Zophar said, right, that things could always get worse. The difference is that Zophar was saying it could get worse because you're a worse sinner than you think you are. And what Elihu is doing is focusing on future righteousness and suggesting that the struggle now may be preparing you for greater righteousness. So it has to do with a past perspective versus a future perspective. And so in that sense, what Elihu is saying is helpful, because we have to acknowledge that sometimes suffering does lead us away from future calamity that would be worse than we experience now. It happens with physical pain, right? You have a pain in your body that's telling you you should get something looked at. You know, a splitting pain in your side is sometimes your appendix telling you that if you don't go to the doctor, you will die. You know, maybe the joint pain that you're experiencing in your knees or your shoulder is telling you you probably shouldn't play football on Thanksgiving Day because you're too old and you will blow out your Achilles like Aaron Rodgers. But there are other ways that suffering can set up thriving, right? If you started a business, you know that generally there's a period of lean years that you're going to have to go through and before you get to hopefully prosperity. Immigrants come to America, many of our parents or grandparents out of situations of absolute poverty in order to make a life for themselves that will be better. And a lot of times it's in those moments where unexpected things happen that make the suffering even worse than we had anticipated, but later we look back and go, oh, I see why that was necessary. I have a friend who planted a church in upstate New York, and when you plant a church, like starting a business or anything else where you're kind of starting from scratch, it's a pretty risky financial proposition, especially in church planting, because you have nothing to sell. You know, it's not a business. You just sell the gospel and hope that, you know, God provides. So in the first couple of years of his church plant, things were very lean for the church, and consequently for him, he was living away from the church, living far away from the church in a really small farmhouse out in the country, the only thing he could afford with his wife and two very young children. And, you know, the windows were cracked, the porch was falling apart, all this stuff. And then one day, during a really dry spell, not unlike the one we're having now, his well dried up. And so he's living there in this house with, you know, his two young children, his wife, far away from any community, and he has no running water. And he has no money to fix it, and neither does the church. And the way he tells this story, you know, it was like at the moment, he's like, what did I do to deserve this? Like, here I am. I'm already risking a lot to plant this church. I'm doing it for God, and now I don't even have running water. And so he was probably thinking, God is silent. Why is God not answering? But he knows now, as he looks back, that the community did come around him. And he looks back that in that moment was extremely dark. And again, the future promise doesn't make it any less dark. But he did see how it came to teach him how to thrive now. What Elihu would say to my friend at that moment was, maybe God was speaking. You just weren't ready to hear what he had to say. Job 33:29, behold, God does all these things twice, 3 times to the man to bring back his soul from the pit, that he may be lighted with the light of life. What if God is saving you from some other thing that he knows but you don't? What if God is setting you up for something else in the future that you don't know about yet? What if God is speaking 2, 3 times, but we aren't ready to hear it? Elihu goes on, and despite whatever positive insight he offers in his first speech, he turns now to a topic that's not quite as pastorally sensitive, which is he comes back to this idea that no one can pervert God's justice. He appears to turn his sights on the 3 friends, but ends up attacking Job. Job 34:10, therefore hear me, you men of understanding, far be it from God that he should do wickedness, and from the Almighty that he should do wrong. For according to the work of man he will repay him, and according to his ways he will make it befall him. Of a truth God will not do wickedly, and the Almighty will not pervert justice. So he starts out with this sort of awe and perspective on God's power and the first chapter of God moving you in this direction of something he has planned for you. And then it's like he turns around completely and starts making an argument about wickedness, very similar to what Job's friends had. He says of Job, men of understanding will say to me, and the wise man who hears me will say, Job speaks without knowledge, his words are without insight. Would that Job were tried to the end, because he answers like wicked men, for he adds rebellion to his sin, he claps his hands among us and multiplies his words against God. In other words, Job's been asking for a hearing for God, and all of a sudden Elihu, who in the first chapter was like, don't worry, my words aren't going to be too heavy, now he says, I wish God would take this to the bitter end. I wish God would give you a trial so that you can face the punishment that you truly deserve, because now you're multiplying your words against God, you're adding rebellion to your own wickedness. And then he goes on to say that the reason God isn't listening to you is because it's not because God isn't speaking, it's because he doesn't want to listen to a wicked person like you. Surely God does not hear an empty cry, nor does the Almighty regard it. How much less when you say that you do not see him, that the case is before him and you are waiting for him. And now because his anger does not punish and he does not take much note of transgression, Job opens his mouth in empty talk and multiplies words without knowledge. So here's where I think Elihu's age is important and where I think it comes into play and where I think he speaks for the reader. Again, it's to use Joey's phrase of the dissonance of the moment. When Elihu starts out, he wants to agree with Job that God is sovereign, that Elihu's trying to find some other reason and rationale why the suffering might have happened to Job. But then as he's talking, I think he finds this second note that doesn't harmonize with the first. And he does a complete pendulum swing over to the other side. This is not to be negative about younger people, but, it is a reality. So again, if you're a younger person, you're like every younger person that has ever existed. It's not unique to you. But a lot of times, have you noticed how quickly their opinions change? Look at the society and culture surrounding teenagers. The pendulum swings back and forth between opinions going one way to opinions going the other. And sometimes, when you're dealing with your teenagers, they can have one opinion one day and a totally different one the next day. And it lasts all the way through young adulthood. So I think that's what's happening with Elihu here. He's finding this second note, and as he's talking, he sort of realizes and convinces himself, wait a second, maybe Job actually is wicked. And like the reader, he's hearing these two notes that don't go together in his mind, and he's going back and forth between one and the other. It's almost like in the midst of making his case, he suddenly realizes that he wants to make the case for Job, but then realizes he has to make the case against him, and he just ends up as confused as everyone else. So it's like he starts the speech in a rage. He tries to find the path along the way, only to discover that all of his clinical explanations of God, which is what he's coming back to, his clinical explanations of God don't actually hold up to the moment at hand. He's trying to apply wisdom, logic, understanding, and it's led him to this downward spiral where he just ends up confused, which is actually, I think, where we're supposed to be at this point in Job. Where you go, we've applied logic, we've applied our earthly wisdom, we've looked at it, and Job's friends looked at it clinically, but there's more to the story that we don't understand and that our words and our clinical explanations of God will never help us get to. And so this is how Elihu concludes. God's majesty is beyond our comprehension. And Elihu continued and said, bear with me a little and I will show you, for I have yet something to say on God's behalf. I will get my knowledge from afar and ascribe righteousness to my Maker. For truly my words are not false. One who is perfect in knowledge is with you. This is where Elihu gets the tag of being a little arrogant, because, if you were a young man and you listened to four old men talking, and then finally you said, here, don't worry, one who is perfect in knowledge is with you. They'd be like, well, you're kind of an arrogant little kid, shut up and sit down, So, but there's a reason that, again, God doesn't chastise him. And I think it's because even if he's saying something in youthful arrogance, the one thing that he says that's different from what all his friends said, and this is where I think he's on this pendulum swing, is he says, I will get my knowledge from afar, but here's the key phrase, and I'll ascribe righteousness to my Maker. In other words, I'm not going to be the judge and jury over Job's righteousness. Even though he just kind of was, and he did just in the previous 2 chapters, if you read them, he does kind of attack Job and say that he was wicked. He finally gets this point where he goes, maybe I'm just going to leave that part up to my Maker. Like maybe I'll not try to discern whether this suffering comes from wickedness or leading you to righteousness or whatever. I'll leave that to my Maker. But that's part of where I think he is in that confusion. I think we have to follow his pathway to get to his main conclusion, which is this. Job 36:5, behold, God is mighty, and he does not despise any. He is mighty in strength of understanding. He goes on later, behold, God is exalted in his power. Who is a teacher like him? By the way, listen to the word behold. Behold, behold. It's the word, it just means gaze upon. Like, look, see what I've discovered. Behold, God is exalted in his power. Who is a teacher like him? Who has prescribed for him his way? Or who can say, you have done wrong? Remember to extol his work, of which men have sung. All mankind has looked on it. Man holds it from afar. Behold, God is great, and we know him not. The number of his years is unsearchable. For he draws up the drops of water. They distill his mist and rain, which the skies pour down and drop on mankind abundantly. Can anyone understand the spreading of the clouds? The thunderings of his pavilion? Behold, he scatters his lightning about him and covers the roots of the sea. For by these he judges people. He gives food in abundance. He covers his hands with the lightning and commands it to strike the mark. Its crashing declares his presence. The cattle also declare that he rises. You can see Elihu's argument turned from an explanation of what God is doing to simply describing who God is. He's moving from a theology of God and a theology of suffering to a description of the character and the power of God. And this is why this Elihu speech is in the text. This is the reason it's here. Because he moved from these clinical explanations to this place where he's just gazing upon God himself. He's saying, behold, behold, behold. By this point in the book, even though we as a reader have a greater understanding of the context, right? Because we saw God's conversation with the adversary. We saw what God said about Job as the reader. Job and his three friends, Elihu, they don't know any of that. So they're more confused than we are. But there is a part of us that we should have gotten to this place where we go, we do not have any answers to explain why this is happening. We do not have answers to dictate or put words to the mind of God. And that's especially true for Job and his friends. So the book moves us from this place where we search for answers, but instead of finding them, we simply come to gaze on the greatness of God. In God's greatness, he causes rain to fall. The skies open, and it rains abundantly on mankind, all of mankind. Can you explain it? Do you know why that occurs? He says that God's provision, food in abundance, is itself a judgment from God. Why does God bring food in abundance to the wicked and to the righteous? Why does that happen? It's a judgment of God. It's causing us to ask these questions that we've looked at in the book of Job. Why is God doing what he does? Why do the wicked sometimes prosper? Why does God hold his protective hand on the lightning in a storm and command it to strike where it will? The fact that it crashes at all where he intends is the mark of his presence. And he goes, remember, there's been this consistent pattern of like Job and his buddies being like, you're dumber than the beasts of the field, or Job being like, even the beasts of the field know this and you don't get it. And now Elihu draws on that and he says, even the cattle know this. Like everything else that we've been talking about, trying to figure out righteousness and wickedness and suffering and all that, it's clear we don't have any answers for that. But the thing that the beasts of the field know that we also can know is to gaze upon the majesty of God and gaze upon his greatness and his power. Verse 10, by the breath of God, ice is given, and the broad waters are frozen fast. He loads the thick cloud with moisture. The clouds scatter his lightning. They turn around and around by his guidance to accomplish all that he commands them on the face of the habitable world, whether for correction or for his land or for love, he causes it to happen. The clouds in the sky go the direction of God's command. Sometimes they send rain, sometimes they send snow. The waters of the frozen lake are frozen solid. Lightning is scattered, and it's true across the entire world. It's true across the habitable world. It's not just wicked, it's not just righteous. God causes this to happen. Why? Is it for correction, Elihu asks? Does God sometimes send lightning or does God allow certain things to cause us to correct course? Maybe. Is it out of love? Maybe. We talked earlier in the series about something like a forest fire, natural wildfires. And we look at them, maybe the ones here in New Jersey caused by great drought, and then we don't have forests that are attuned to this sort of pattern, so it's pretty much just a negative. But there's a lot of areas where forest fires are intended to renew the ground. The lightning strikes, and to cause these forest fires. Is it for correction? Is it for love? Is it just because it's God's land? That God owns all of it? That he sends the lightning to crash and strike where it will? To bring wildfires or to bring destruction or growth or new life? Can you answer that question? Do you know? Could it be all three at the same time? This is what Elihu is getting us to ask. Is it because the creation is simply God's land that he seeks to feed it? Job 37:16. Do you know the balancing of the clouds, the wondrous works of him who is perfect in knowledge, you whose garments are hot when the earth is still because of the south wind? All of us, Job's friends, Elihu, Job, we're all standing here on the earth. And have you ever stood outside in the heat and you experience the south wind, the wind coming up and warming your very garments and getting you to a place where, you're sitting there, and what Elihu is saying is, you're just receiving it. You're standing here on the receiving end of the south wind, but can you cause the wind? Do you know where the wind came from? Have you made it warmer in the south and cooler in the north so that when that wind comes up over that dry and barren land, it warms you? Because you're just standing there as the recipient. Can you explain where it comes from or cause it to happen? Out of the north comes golden splendor. God is clothed with awesome majesty. The Almighty, we cannot find him. He is great in power, justice and abundant righteousness he will not violate. Therefore, men fear him. He does not regard any who are wise in their own conceit. Elihu goes from suggesting that perhaps God is speaking and Job isn't listening, to thinking that maybe Job is wicked after all, to what I think is a state of near confusion where he's like, maybe God's just beyond us to understand. He sort of finds himself along the way in this place where he goes, I really can't explain anything, but what I know for certain that all creation cries out is the glory and the majesty of God. And so I think he actually closes his argument with this great clarity. God is almighty and great in power. God will not violate justice and righteousness. We can't even figure out how clouds work or where rain comes from. And even though we in the 21st century have a better scientific understanding of it, we can't really make it happen. Don't you think that if we could figure out how to get rain clouds, there are certain, China's tried it. If we could figure out how to get rain clouds to come over New Jersey, we'd probably do it right now. Don't you think that that we would try to create weather patterns that were more that were better for us, that were better in our minds for the land? Can we bring rain to our drought-parched land? Can we cause it to snow in the summer? No. Or the summer, or the winter. Can we bring the snow? Can we go out and freeze over the lakes that don't freeze anymore? If we can't do that, then how can we even attempt to describe the power and the justice and the righteousness of God? If we can't do these simple things, like bringing rain, where are we even starting when we come to describe God? I said that I think Elihu sort of spirals into this confusion after trying to make his argument, and maybe I'm giving him too much credit. Maybe he doesn't end up in this place of clarity that I think we should. But whether or not he knows it or senses it, we can point to this in the book of Job and see it. This is where all of their arguments have led to. Why do you want a God that you can explain? Why do you want a God that you can understand? What makes you think you want that? The problem with Job's friends, and I think the corner that Elihu sort of backs himself into, is that they want to explain reality through their understanding of this orderly God who fits in their box. The orderly God who always responds the way that I think he's going to, or the way that I think he should. The orderly God who just does exactly what I expect him to do in a way that I understand it and I can explain it. But what if God's orderliness doesn't fit your category of what you think orderliness should be? There's this quote that I came across that I love. It was from David Atkinson's commentary on the book of Job. There is a wildness to the divine ordering of things which the Elihus of this world cannot understand. Like if you want to come at things and you want to be clinical and you want to describe God and have a 1 to 10 point analysis of why God does the things that he does, and you want to come to it and always have an answer, you will never understand God. You will not understand the wildness of who God is. Elihu cannot bear very much reality because his God is too tidy and too small. And this is the problem with all of Job's friends' arguments and ours. How often are we guilty of putting God in a neat and tidy box in which all of our platitudes and cliches about how he operates, all of the things we want to say, we go, we got a verse for that, or we got a phrase we can pull out for that, or here's a little neat cliche, and we can just pull it out whenever we want to, which really only serve to make God small. They don't give you a broad explanation of reality. They give you a small explanation of reality that only a small God can offer. It might help to explain reality according to your own preconceived notions of why things happen. It may make you feel better. There's a lot of ways we look at the world and we just want to go, sometimes we look at poverty and we look at wealth and we look at affluence. And we say, well, maybe if those in poverty would work harder, then they'd have affluence. And then we go to sleep and we feel good about it at night. But that's a platitude. That's just a cliche. That's not what the Scripture says. That's what we say to make us feel better so that we can go to bed at night and think to ourselves, well, it's not really, something I have to worry much about. Because that's ultimately what happens, is that it doesn't just change the way that we explain reality or the way that we see God. What ends up happening is that we remove personal responsibility from the equation. Because if we think we can just explain it, like even if it is a friend's suffering, right? And we just go, well, God never sends anything we can't handle. We say, well, God must have a purpose for this, or like we've explored a few times in the series, like, well, when you come out of this, your faith's going to be as pure gold. And we say those things, but what it really does is just abdicate the responsibility from us of actually sitting in the mess with them and going, I don't get it. Because that's a lot harder, because you have to acknowledge that you're serving a God you don't understand, whose glory and majesty and you can see, but you don't get it. You can't actually come into contact with it. If we look at the world and we think we can diagnose it or prescribe the solution or tell people why God is acting the way he is, we've already committed a certain type of heresy by assuming that in my thinking or in my words, I can contain God. How can you, a creature, the one who receives the southern wind, possibly put into a category how God, the God who sends the wind to begin with? It not only diminishes God, but it diminishes our responsibility in the world. And this is something that Jesus picks up on in Matthew 5. This is from the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard that it was said, and you would never think that this is where he's going to go, using the same thing as what what Elihu's just talking about. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. Okay, great. We get that. That's what Jesus did. Look at his rationale. Why do you do that? Why do you love even your enemies? Because God makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good and sends rain on the just and the unjust. Why do you love your enemies? Because God loves your enemies. If God, this is what Elihu's getting at, if God is sending sun all over the entire habitable world, with whether they're evil or righteous, if God is sending rain on the just and the unjust, then who are you to stand in judgment over them? Who are you to try to explain why some person is wicked and another is righteous? When we try to minimize who God is or explain why he does what he does, we end up diminishing his majesty and putting ourselves in the position that Job's friends did, where we make ourselves the judge and jury. Where we say, well, we get to decide. But that's God's decision, and he's sending rain and he's sending sun on the righteous and the unrighteous. What are you doing? And whatever other faults Elihu has, and despite the fact that at times during his speech, he does act like he's the judge over Job, his concluding word is that we have ended in a position where God is mighty and majestic. He's full of justice and righteousness, and we cannot explain the wildness of the God who has revealed himself to us. We've been invited into the presence of God to see him for who he truly is. Everything else has been stripped away. All of our arguments about suffering, all of our conclusions are sitting in the ash heap that Job himself is sitting on. Everything we thought we knew about who God is, jumbled up and confused as we consider the greatness of his majesty that makes the rain fall on the just and the unjust, and the sun to warm the righteous and the unrighteous. And it's only in that position, when we stop trying to explain who God is or what God has done, but we're simply ready to receive him as he truly is, that God will finally enter the story and speak. That's what we see next week. That's the message of the gospel. Let's pray. Father, we know, because your word tells us of your greatness. We know because we see it all around us in nature, when the lightning strikes or the rain comes or the rain doesn't come, or the ground freezes or it doesn't, we see your majesty. Lord, we have been invited in to experience you and who you really are. There's a reason that at the very beginning of this book, you allowed the adversary to challenge you. There's a reason that you accepted the challenge. There was a reason you were willing to let yourself be put on trial. Because as Elihu finally understands, and as we do, you are majestic and beyond our comprehension. Lord, be with us now as we respond to worship. I pray these things in your name. Amen.